supposed to be brutal snow and sleet and rain and conflagrations or whatever else is supposed to be happening this evening. We do appreciate your dedication. You bring perspectives that we need to hear here on campus. Secondly, we are not meeting next week. How many students? We're not meeting next week because it is a school vacation week. That's what it's called, right? Spring break. Spring break. So we'll all be down in Fort Lauderdale on the beach.
Yes. Cruising in the sand.
Wishful thinking. However, we will be back here the week after for a session that I think you'll find particularly intriguing because it will present the work of our Professor Anthony Braga, who has done a lot of work with the Boston Police Department, and Commissioner William Gross, who,
not gross.
And let me also note, the name is spelled G-R-O-S-S. Many people pronounce that as gross, but in fact it is Gross. Commissioner Gross will be here, assuming that there isn't some crisis somewhere out in the community that requires him to be there rather than here. And I strongly encourage you to invite friends and colleagues to that session. We don't have that many opportunities to go one-on-one with our police commissioner. And even though police headquarters is just a couple of hundred yards from here, it will be, I think, intriguing to have him here on campus to talk about the police department's efforts to address issues of race and resiliency. So, not this week, but the week after. Let me see, are there any other announcements? No, I don't think so. I had the opportunity to be in on the beginning of the Indicators Project at the Boston Foundation, many years ago. And I don't think that any of us anticipated that what some of us thought would be a way of developing some kind of baseline dashboard data would grow into the kind of process and set of outcomes that the Indicator Project has become as a way of shaping policy, not just within the Boston Foundation itself, but really within our region. And a lot of that growth and depth has emerged because of the work of Luke Schuster, who is our speaker, one of our two speakers this evening. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Luke to talk both about the Boston Foundation and the work that he has done and is doing within the context of how private philanthropy can shape policymaking in this part of the world. So, Luke, you're on.
Thanks, Ted. Is there any chance I pull this off without a mic?
No.
Fair enough. What I thought I'd do is briefly say a little bit about the work of Boston Indicators, a teeny bit on the history that Ted references, but then mostly present main findings from a big research paper we released back in October, just showing a bunch of charts and graphs from that on here. So a little bit about Boston Indicators. We are the research center at the Boston Foundation. I suspect most people in the room are familiar with the foundation, but maybe not everybody. Over 100 years old, long-standing charity in Boston. Our broad mission is to tackle the big pressing challenges of our day in Boston and the broader region. I think of how we do that in two buckets. One is direct grant making to support community groups actively working to improve our communities. But the actual scope of that grant making on a given year is actually frankly pretty small in the context of city government in Boston. So the sort of second pillar of how we try to improve the city is to engage in important civic debates and help influence change at a public policy level. The work of Boston Indicators as the research center really fits into that second bucket, the civic leadership work of the foundation. Began back in 2000, at the time called the Boston Indicators Project. About a year ago we decided we've been around for 18 years, let's drop project from the title. And we've also pivoted in an important way, doing a little bit less just providing data online through our website and trying to do more research and analysis that tells a story about how we're doing as a community. And so this research, I think, hopefully is a good example of where we're trying to take that data to a better sense of understanding about the big challenges facing our communities. So let me first just flag a few recent reports. I won't talk about the findings from these, but just to give you a flavor of some of the other work we've done recently, in case you're interested in checking that out on our website. We did a big report about a year and a half ago in partnership with the BPDA. Ted's on the board there, doing a kind of deep dive analysis of the Latino population in Boston. If it weren't for growth in Boston's Latino population, our population overall would be roughly flat since 1980. So just some really interesting findings there. We did a similar sort of deep dive, in this case on our state's LGBT population, in partnership with the Fenway Institute in Boston, which is a leading public health research center with a real focus on the LGBT community. This past summer we did a report in partnership with the Health and Wellness Program area at the foundation around our state's opioid crisis. I knew that the opioid crisis was real and growing. I had no idea that our opioid-related death rate in Massachusetts was 2 times the national average. So we did a kind of deep dive into what might be explaining why the crisis is so much greater here in Massachusetts. A big report we released a few months ago on the 2020 census. There's a bunch of community groups that are starting to organize to get ready to do get-out-the-count efforts early next year when the 2020 census starts. So we did a piece trying to just describe how the census works and articulate what's at stake for Massachusetts if we don't get an accurate count. And then this report, Boston's Booming, But for Whom? And what I'll do from here on out is just go through the main findings from this report. So what motivated this report was trying to do a kind of high-level look at how Boston's economy is working and sort of asking the question, is it delivering for everybody? The sort of top-line finding from this work, I don't think will be surprising to people, but hopefully the specific details we lay out are useful in the work we're doing. Boston's economy really is booming. Our population has grown, the economy has grown, unemployment's low, and yet there's just this persistent sense on the ground like it's not delivering for everybody. Too many people are struggling to pay for childcare, to save for college, to afford the rent. So we wanted to kind of look under the hood on this and try and describe how both of those things can be true at the same time. I think increasingly of this set of issues as the pressing challenge of our time as a region. We have this thriving economy, but it's just not working in a whole bunch of important ways. So let's get into the data. Really quickly, and I already referenced a few of these first slides. Massachusetts' economy overall is outpacing economic growth nationwide, although interestingly this hasn't always been the case. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, output per worker actually lagged the national average. We had the Massachusetts miracle during the sort of 1980s period. In the last couple of decades, we've significantly outpaced the national average. So good news, our economy has been growing. Unemployment's low everywhere at the end point of this graph. The shape of this graph obviously mirrors the business cycle. But good news that the Boston region has lower unemployment even than Massachusetts overall, and then significantly lower than the US average. Boy, it's tough seeing these slides, it's so big. Our state workforce has the highest share of college degrees of any state in the country. Almost half of our workforce has a college degree or more. One thing that's translated into, in part, is higher wages than most of the rest of the country. We have the 6th highest median household income in Massachusetts at about $73,000 a year. And then finally, home values up significantly. You can see, if we just sort of walk through these lines from the bottom to the top, the shape of the US average in terms of median home values, you can see nationwide we've just basically recovered to the pre-recession levels. Massachusetts a little bit better, Greater Boston a little bit better, and then look at that spike for the city of Boston. This was something that really jumped out at me when we pulled this data. The city really clustered tightly with Greater Boston and Massachusetts in this earlier period, but then we've just seen this dramatic skyrocketing in recent years. So I first teed this slide up as a positive story. It's good that our home values have gone up, but obviously reasonable people can look at this and say, wait a minute, this is not a good story, this is a bad story. In Boston...
So, sorry Luke, I'm going to take advantage of your offer to have people ask you questions. I'm also struck by what's going on from 1999 to 2004, because we actually look like we're near-ish the national average for a while there, and suddenly we skyrocket away from it. Is that because our economy boomed so strongly, everything became expensive? But why did we diverge?
That's a great, I'm not entirely sure. It may well be an effect of that growth in the economy in the sort of late 80s through the early 90s and sort of finally playing out in terms of higher home values statewide. And again, they're so clustered. That story seems like a similar one for the city, the region, and the state, whereas there's really a different story emerging in later years. Yeah. Was there a question or comment back there? So back on the city piece of this, one way to think about, okay, is this a good story or is this a bad story, is if you're a long-standing homeowner in Boston, this is translating into increased wealth for your household. Basically 2/3 of the city of Boston is renters. So if you're a renter, this is largely just translating into higher rents. And I think that's a good transition into the first set of key findings in terms of where the economy really isn't delivering for everybody, which is that Boston's middle class is really hollowing out. So I'm going to describe this by plowing in a little bit more into the housing cost issue for renters in the city. Trying to answer this question, can middle-income renters really afford to live in Boston? So here's just some really basic math to kind of benchmark this. Median monthly rent for an average unit listed on the market today, $2,600 a month. Times 12, about $31,000 a year. Compared to median household income in the city of Boston, $61,000 a year. At the median, rent costs 51% of income. In housing circles, folks may well be familiar with this. There's this rough benchmark that says if you're spending more than 30% of your income in rent, your housing cost burdened. So at the median, this sort of prototypical household is spending well above that threshold. It would take over $100,000 a year to be above that 30% benchmark. Now, this is somewhat crude because this is citywide rents, a median for the city as a whole. We know that there's tremendous variation both on rents and incomes across neighborhoods. So the next slide is a screenshot of an interactive map we have on our website associated with this report, which allows you to see this math for every neighborhood in the city. So you can hover on the website. I just took one sample Dorchester tract. Here, rents are a little bit lower than the citywide average, but also incomes are. So again, it would take around $100,000 a year to not be housing cost burdened at that 30% threshold. We just color-coded this map where any of the tracts that are in light green or light blue, you actually can afford, quote unquote, rent at the median, and then everything else in the dark blue is a no. So what has this meant in terms of the actual composition of the city of Boston? The next graph looks at the change in the total number of households who are low income, middle income, and high income living in the city of Boston from 1990 to today. And you can just see this stark picture. The city overall has grown since 1990, but that growth has been at the lower end of the distribution and the higher end of the distribution, with a real hollowing out in the middle. A couple of observations as we kind of process what we thought this meant for the city. I actually think, in a certain sense, there may be important positive stories about what we're doing in Boston on the left and on the right-hand side here. So actually, starting on the right-hand side, we have an increasingly high-wage, high-skill economy that's attracting a knowledge base that I think is helping to fuel that growth we saw in some of those earlier slides. So I think this isn't necessarily bad that we've seen an increase in 43,000 high-income households. On the low-income end, there's some interesting research that I'm seeing emerging from a couple different places that really suggests, compared to other US cities, Boston actually has done a better job at providing low-income housing for low-income residents. Now, there's no question there's long waiting lists to access that housing. There's much more we can do. And I'll show you in the next slide in a minute, the Department of Neighborhood Development for the City of Boston just did a report this past November where they calculated the share of all housing units citywide that are income restricted in some way. And I'll show a table for this citywide and then at every neighborhood level in the city, and it's I think, quite striking. Roughly 1 in 5 housing units in the entire city of Boston is income restricted in some way. So that might be public housing. It could be new units that were created through inclusionary zoning, through the private market. You see the totals on the bottom, 19% of all units citywide. I was really struck by how high this number was. And then look at a couple neighborhoods. Look at Roxbury. Almost half of all of the units in Roxbury is income restricted. 48% in Lower Roxbury South End. I think there's some really interesting questions here about, have we concentrated this housing too much and not spread it enough across the city? They argue in this report that Boston has a higher share of income restricted housing than any other city in the country. Okay, so that's kind of big trends with the middle class and some issues around housing. The next key finding from this work is another one that I don't think is going to be surprising, but it's, I think, helpful to see how stark the data is, which is that income inequality is up. We know income inequality is a rising national, really rising international issue, and it's absolutely playing out here locally. So this slide just looks at data for Boston and then next for Massachusetts. The left-hand slide, the Brookings Institute has done a study a few years in a row comparing income inequality in major metro areas in the United States. Boston has the 7th highest income inequality according to this measure. Interestingly, according to this analysis 2 years ago, Boston actually had the highest income inequality of any city in the country. So a little bit of progress, still in the top 10, nowhere near where we want to be. I compared the numbers at the 20th percentile and 95th percentile from this report to the previous one. And the big reason why this gap closed a bit is because the bottom 20% increased a little. The time frame for this shift coincides directly with the state's increase of the minimum wage from $8 an hour to $11 an hour over 3 years. I don't think it's fair to suggest that's the only reason why we've closed this gap, but I do think it suggests the kind of public policy decision we can make at the local level to move the needle a bit on these big trends. So that's Boston. Very similar table comparing states. This is from the Economic Policy Institute. They found that Massachusetts has the 6th highest income inequality out of the 50 states. So what's happening to cause this? There's been a lot of interesting research, again, at the national level around the kind of divergence between economic growth over the last several decades and worker compensation. I want to show that data for Massachusetts. So this line is effectively the same line I showed in one of my first slides, just looking at economic productivity in Massachusetts from the late 70s to today. And we see, for the most part, a continued upward trend. Let's compare that economic growth with median household income. Pretty flat since 2000. So there's a whole lot of big structural changes in the national economy that I think are leading to this kind of trend. But as we've seen the decline in unionization, market consolidation, there's hot debates in economics around what's causing this divergence between economic productivity and worker compensation, but we can see it's really playing out here locally as well. This graph on the right-hand side just looks at the middle of the distribution. Obviously, it's really important to analyze how these trends are playing out across other points in the distribution. So for this report, we did an analysis that looks at the change in median hourly wages for people that at the low, middle, and top end of the distribution from the late 70s to today. And that's what this graph shows. So the 10th income percentile is the lowest 10% of earners, moving up to the highest 95th percent. The bottom line was median hourly wages back in 1979 in inflation-adjusted terms compared to the top line, median hourly wages today. And you can see folks at the bottom towards the middle end of this distribution, almost no real wage increases over almost 40 years. You see some real meaningful increases at the top. Interestingly, this analysis just looks at ordinary income. It's almost certainly the case if we were able to build in investment income, income from business ownership, that this gap would increase even more. It's also just important to flag that, again, I've stressed that sort of there's a connection between the city, the state, and the national story on some of these big trends. It's also a big issue internationally, although much stronger in terms of these trends here in the United States. So this left-hand graph just looks at the share of all income nationwide going to different points of the income distribution. So the blue line is how much of all income nationwide is going to the top 1% of earners, and you can see how that has increased over time. The bottom 50% is now taking home less than the top 1% of income earners is in the United States. There's been a little bit of that trend in Western Europe, but nowhere near the severity of it. This data comes from a new sort of international think tank, the World Inequality Lab, led by Edward Saez and Thomas Piketty. So I think just useful to put some of this in broader international context. Another really important way to look at these trends in inequality is across race. This graph is going to look at median household income across race, first for the city of Boston, and then we'll do it for Metro Boston. So here we see huge disparities within Boston across race, with white households earning, roughly speaking, 2 times as much as households of color. The second highest bar is 2 or more races. I think a lot of what's going to be pulling that bar up is that a lot of those households, one of the races is a white person. Next, let's look at this for Metro Boston. Pretty similar story for every other race except for Asians, interestingly. Asian households in Greater Boston earn more than twice as much as Asian households within the city of Boston. So there's a lot going on here. I think there's potentially a really interesting story about just how diverse the sort of broad, frankly crude bucket Asian really is, and it's true across all of these racial categories for sure. We're actually in the process of doing, I think, a really neat research project with researchers at UMass Boston that is tentatively titled Changing Faces of Greater Boston, so keep your eye out for that report. But it's trying to dive deep into how these trends are playing out within Greater Boston. And as a teaser preview for you guys, the next slide is a draft graph from the section of that report that focuses on the Asian community. And it's a scatter plot to help visualize this intra-Asian diversity within Greater Boston. Temperature warning. I didn't put that up. So there's a lot to digest here, but the basic idea is on the x-axis, we're looking at the share of a nation of origin within the Asian race that has a college degree or more. The y-axis is median household income, and then the size of the bubble is the population size with that origin within Greater Boston. And you can just see what a wide range there is, right? So you have very high skill, high wage Indians, and much lower skill, lower education, and much lower wage Cambodians, Vietnamese. So I think this helps visualize that wide range within the city of Boston. You see similar distributions across other races, but nowhere near that wide a spread. Poverty, really important to not just focus on trends in the middle, which I've done a lot through this presentation, but I think sort of no matter how we're doing at the middle or top end of the distribution, I think we could all agree we have enough wealth, resources to provide an adequate baseline standard of living for everybody, and yet poverty still persists in our city and our region and our state. So just a little bit of data on that. This graph just compares the official federal poverty rate for Massachusetts to the national average over a 17-year time frame. Good news that poverty is lower in Massachusetts than nationwide. I think one really troubling takeaway, both for the US and for Massachusetts, if you compare where we are in 2017 to where we were right before the Great Recession, we're still a bit above those pre-recession levels of poverty. Right, so we're many years into an economic recovery, but we still haven't fully tipped back on poverty. Now, as many of you probably know, this federal poverty measure is a very crude, very kind of low benchmark for what it really takes to make ends meet. The Obama administration, through the Census Bureau, did a really interesting data exercise of calculating a better, more nuanced poverty measure. It's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure. And it factors in differences like regional differences in cost of living. So the next slide I'm going to show you is a comparison. Unfortunately, they only have that data at the state level, but I'll show you that data for Massachusetts compared to the rest of the country on the supplemental poverty measure. And we see according to that measure, we're actually middle of the pack. So when you factor in our much higher cost of living compared to the rest of the country, the story is much less positive. And a real cautionary tale here is California. California has shot up on the supplemental poverty measure in recent years. As much as housing costs have risen in Massachusetts, they've risen even faster in California, and it's leading the poverty under a measure that really reflects that dynamic to shoot up rapidly. So I think as sort of troubling as the story is here, we have an opportunity to act to sort of defend against that real extreme scenario. Okay, finally I want to talk about economic mobility. So a bunch of the measures I've walked through so far are either points in time or sort of looking at recent trend lines. There's this growing body of research that's looking at long-term trends across the generation and seeing how well we're doing at sort of raising living standards for whole generations of kids over time. The next few slides I'm going to show are based on local data that Opportunity Insights, a new think tank that's actually located at Harvard, had been called the Equality of Opportunity Project. Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, and John Friedman, a sort of trio of leading economists, have created this new research group. They got sort of one-of-a-kind access to national tax return data and census data to allow us over many generations to track broad trends in income and economic mobility, and they've shared that data publicly with local researchers. So this sort of depends on some of that data, and I think there's some really interesting, troubling stories. So the first one, and this is data that's really made the rounds, so I suspect many of you have seen versions of this, looking at the share of people born in a given birth year who earn more than their parents by the time they're working adults. And this is for Massachusetts. So back in 1940, someone born in Massachusetts in 1940, by the time they were 30 years old, had a 91% chance of out-earning their parents. Look at how that's changed across these generations.
Wow.
Someone born in 1980 had a 55% chance of out-earning their parents by the time they were a working adult. The story is almost identical nationwide, although even a sharper decline. Nationwide, someone born in 1980 had literally a coin flip chance, a 50% chance of out-earning their parents by the time they were a working adult.
Wait, does that go across races?
Great question. So this is just everybody combined. The next few slides actually are going to get to some race breakdowns for us locally, and we'll see how these trends diverge. So this is Massachusetts. We wanted to see, well, okay, how are we doing in Boston specifically? And the final section of this report looks at Boston specifically. The next couple slides are a little dense, but I think it's worth taking a second to understand what I'm going to show. The measures are conceptually very similar, but a little bit different. So this looks at everybody statewide who was born in those given birth years. The next slide I'm going to look at looks just at low-income kids born at the 25th percentile of the income distribution and looks at where they land as adults. So similar idea of tracking where a household someone was born into and see where they land as an adult. So this ranks Boston compared to the 100 largest cities in the United States. And you can see here, sort of economic mobility has gone down for everybody nationwide. But compared to other US cities, we actually tie for second highest in terms of mobility for low-income kids in Boston, tied with Minneapolis. So what that 44.9 means is a kid born into a household at the 25th percentile of the distribution, on average, moved up to about the 45th percentile of the distribution. So some growth, but still not to the median of the distribution. The next slide is going to take the same data, but then break it out by race and by gender. It gets a little complicated when you're breaking out by race and gender because you're looking at the household a kid was born into, but then you have to track them as an individual because you might have a household of a man and a woman, of a white man and a black woman. So this next slide is the individual outcomes of kids who were born in Boston at the 25th percentile. And here we report them as dollar amounts, just to give you a sense of what the individual income is of someone in this cohort. So just to make sense of it, black females and black males in Boston, compared to black females in other US cities and compared to black males in other US cities, rank first. But if you compare across the categories, we see huge differences, right? So like black males in Boston, on average, ended up earning $23,700. White males in Boston ended up earning over $7,000 more. White males ranked 10th, but that's because they're ranked against other white males. So, what do we make of all this? Is this a good story? Is this a bad story?
Does education experience included?
Say more about what you mean by
Education level, is it included? Are those people, it doesn't matter, high school diploma, bachelor's, master's?
Everyone's included, so
It's a mixture.
yeah, so
Okay.
this is helpful. So what the kind of test is, kids that were born into households at the 25th percentile, regardless of what the education levels of their parents were, and then looks at what their incomes are as an adult. So the next, yeah.
So one thing, and I've looked at this graph a couple of times now, and just noticed this for the first time, white females, interestingly enough, don't do any better than Hispanic females and are less productive in an economic sense than black females. That would seem to go counter to general intuition.
Yeah, and this was actually, there was a bunch of national coverage of these findings nationwide when this report was released earlier this year. Not of the Boston data, but this story holds nationwide. And that is consistent with the national story. So what that means concretely is low-income black females tend to earn more than low-income white females in the United States once they're working adults. One of the big reasons is they're actually working more hours. So this doesn't account for hours worked, I think, by design. So there's some variables like that that help explain why, yeah.
So yeah, probably because in your aggregate, right, your low-income black females are more likely to be leading single-parent households, and so they're working more hours, bringing in more money, and the low-income white females may be more likely to have supports around them, and so they're making less money.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so kind of by design, that's all included here to see what, yeah. So Dan really flagged one of the really interesting findings is sort of higher outcomes than you'd expect for black women and really lower outcomes, especially for black men. And so the next slide I'm going to show you really homes in on that a bit more because I think that's one of the really troubling stories from this data, again, nationally, but also within Boston. So this map is plotting the outcomes just for low-income black men and where they're ending up as adults. A couple things to flag here. So the map on the left is outcomes for black men. Sorry, and on the right, it's for the same measure, but for outcomes for low-income white men as adults. They're on the same scale. So one thing to flag immediately is there's almost no overlap in the colors on these two maps. Right? Almost all green for white men. Green is higher incomes. Almost all red for black men. Now again, you see Boston, we just highlight a couple cities. Black men land at a higher place than most major US cities. But here's the key comparison. Atlanta is the major US city with the lowest outcomes for low-income white men, and they're still at a level that's $2,000 higher than the outcomes for low-income black men in Boston. Is your head spinning? This is tough to wrap your head around, but I think it gets at kind of the essence of some of our real challenges in Boston. How can this possibly kind of be the case? The last couple of slides are going to flag a couple of thoughts I've had about how this might be the case. So one, let's talk about incarceration rates and growing research that connects the effect of mass incarceration, especially for young black men, on economic outcomes over the long term. We wanted to see how Massachusetts compares on incarceration rates, especially for black men, to the rest of the country. So the first left-hand side of this slide compares the incarceration rate, adjusted for population size, for black men in Massachusetts compared to the rest of the country. And we see we actually have the second lowest black male incarceration rate in the country. Next, though, let's compare that to the same exact measure, but for white men. So we actually have the lowest incarceration rate in the whole country for white men, but way below our incarceration rate for black men. I think this helps for me when we finally dug this up, right? I think it helps make some sense. Compared to outcomes for black men in Massachusetts, maybe doing something a teeny bit better, but in a broader context in terms of the support or the interventions we want to provide in an equitable way, we're just still way off. One final graph is looking at home ownership rates. So a lot of this, all the economic mobility data is based on income data, which is an important measure, and we often rely on it because we've got good local data from the Census Bureau or from Opportunity Insights, but it doesn't tell the whole story because households use their wealth to kind of make ends meet also, to pay for college, to buy a home, to make ends meet over the long term. So we wanted to do just a little bit to add to the discussion around wealth. Because home ownership is often the sort of biggest component of a household's wealth, we wanted to just look at home ownership rates by race in the greater Boston area. So we first just ran that data, and we saw big gaps, not surprisingly. But to take it to the next level, we thought, well, what if we just compared households that are earning similar incomes to see if the gap goes away? And you see that's really not the case. So this first graph looks at home ownership rates for middle-income households in greater Boston. And we can see middle-income white households, about 2/3 of them own a home in greater Boston. Communities of color where we have a large enough sample size, around 50% home ownership rates. The next graph is the same thing, but just looking at low-income households, households earning 50% or less of median income. I actually thought this might have been the most striking of the two. 1/3 of white households in greater Boston still own homes. How is that? I suspect it's largely the intergenerational transfer of wealth. You can be a low-income white household, but if you're inheriting a home from the prior generation, you'll still be able to own a home yourself. And that's just very different for communities that don't benefit from, prior generations of wealth-building programs like the GI Bill, like federal home loans that explicitly excluded communities of color in major US cities. And I think this is likely a relic of that imbalance in federal and local home ownership policy. So I share this just to remind ourselves that even if on some of the income measures we're doing better, again, income doesn't tell the whole story. Wealth is another key thing to layer on.
Can you think about that on an intergenerational level? What about models around reparations to look at economically, like how that would impact?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a big, ambitious program around reparations would be designed to help close these gaps.
I should have phrased that. Have you done or are familiar with studies that do this intense of an economic analysis, but on a model of reparations?
I'll just say one that comes to mind. I don't know exactly what you're getting at, but is like Cory Booker, as part of unveiling his 2020 candidacy, has an ambitious program around baby bonds. He's not calling it a program around reparations, but is designed to target increased resources to lower income families. You're shaking your head.
No, because I'm specifically, as you mentioned, the history to add context to the data, right?
Yep.
And as I'm thinking, okay, well, to counteract that, acknowledging context of history, I think it's great that you're mentioning it. Very rarely do I hear people adding that context. Then it's a little frustrating though, because I'm like, wow, this is a lot of research, a lot of in-depth things on things I already know. But then it's like, well, how can we apply this level of model to look at, like, exactly when we broke down the race of Black women, understanding that not just like our intuition of like, oh, well, maybe it's this, but like the hours work, like there's variables that can go into play that add context that like Black women aren't doing better than white men because they make more in this graph.
Yeah.
That level of analysis on reparations specifically to home ownership, like those things that you mentioned. That's why I was like, well, yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And maybe that's a good transition to my final slide, and then I'll be done, and let's just have more of this conversation through Dan's comments and through engaging everybody, is this report, and this may speak to your frustration, was a descriptive analysis of kind of where we've been and where we are today. It was not a deep dive on what we can do to address these problems. We did end with a quick section teasing sort of domains for action. So let me just end with our thoughts about local action areas for building more broadly shared prosperity. And I'll say emphasis on local here. So I think a lot of the action actually needs to be at the national level. A lot of the big economic trends, a lot of the big multi-generational history that we're talking about is issues that we need to address through federal action. But because we are a local kind of think tank, we wanted to flag the local stuff that we can do. So what are they? Reduce incarceration rates, but not just reduce incarceration rates, reform the system overall so that we're doing better training, job training, education, rehabilitation, so that upon re-entry, people can integrate into society more smoothly. Reduce housing costs, obviously. Expand basic labor force protections. This is actually another domain where I'd flag, I think Massachusetts has been a real leader. We have near the highest state level minimum wage. We just passed at the ballot a couple of years ago an earned paid sick time provision. We're sort of unveiling over the next year or so a paid family leave program at the state level. So I think progress here, a lot more that we can do to make sure we have not just low unemployment, but actually high quality jobs so that people can support their families. Fix the jobs housing mismatch and improve our transportation system. This report is admittedly very weak on the massive challenges we have in our transportation system in the region. If we could have a much more reliable local transportation system, people actually afford to live outside of the city and still get to work, get to the doctor's office in a way that's a real challenge now. Improve the quality of our education system. I've spoken hardly anything about our education system in this report, but there's a whole lot of important evidence about how important not just our K-12 education system is, but our pre-K and our higher ed systems are in improving economic opportunity. Eliminate racial bias. Critical, so much growing evidence about how much implicit racial bias affects people's chances over the long term in their careers. A whole host of work we need to do kind of across all of these other areas to make sure that racial bias isn't influencing opportunity in a disparate way. Reduce residential segregation. We live in a very segregated region. The experience that kids have in our public schools within Boston, very different from the leafy suburbs outside of the city. Support the creation of good jobs and provide workforce training ladders for those without college degrees. One of the first slides showed that almost half of our workforce has a college degree. That ranks well compared to the rest of the country, but that still leaves more than half of our workforce that doesn't have a college degree. So what are the opportunities there to get a decent job or move up the skills ladder? Support the establishment of strong social capital. Provide affordable, accessible, high-quality health care. Again, this is a place where Massachusetts has been a leader. We passed universal health reform in the mid-2000s ahead of the rest of the country. But there's a whole lot we need to do to make sure that care is higher quality, more affordable so that it's not a state and local budget buster so that we can afford other important interventions. And then finally, welcome new immigrants and provide supports to integrate them into our neighborhoods, schools, and local economy. The mobility data that Opportunity Insights has, they have an interesting thread where they've compared mobility rates for recent immigrants compared to mobility rates for native-born people, and the mobility rates for new immigrants are much higher. So that can be an important engine of economic growth for the region. And it really is a part of the story, especially for Boston's resurgence in recent decades, is us welcoming more foreign-born immigrants. The share of our foreign-born population almost doubled from 1990 to today, from about 10% of Boston's population to about 20% today. So that's a lot. Thanks a lot. Really look forward to discussing this more with Dan and the audience. Oh.
Do you want to take questions? Or?
Yeah, what do we, I'd be happy to talk about this now, or just go right to Dan and talk all at the end. Okay.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So I get to be sort of, which is rare for me, I get to be kind of discussant / respondent this evening. My name is Dan O'Brien. I'm faculty here in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and the School of Criminal Justice and Criminology, Criminology and Criminal Justice. I also direct the center on campus that's based in the School of Public Policy called the Boston Area Research Initiative, and I direct our educational programs in urban informatics. So, the title really doesn't matter very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way Luke started, a little bit about the institutions that I run and how I think about the world to kind of give you context for how I'm responding to Luke. But then I really want my role here. I loved Luke's report. I found it, and his team's report, it's excellent work. It really tells a story, a depressing story, but a story. And it's a call to action in a lot of ways. But I also, I like to embrace the opportunity to be crabby. So I'm gonna pose a couple of tough questions at the end, which I hope are not interpreted as critiques of Luke's work as much as they are just me anxiously navel-gazing at the challenge that is before us that Luke has kind of presented. So I'll get to it with that as preamble. So I think a lot about smart cities, quote unquote. And I don't think about it because I love the term. I think about it because I do a lot of work with data and analytics around cities, and this has become a real sort of catchphrase out there in the literature, right? Or not even literature. Out there, like if you're sitting around watching, you know, the NCAA March Madness in a couple weeks, right? There will be advertisements by Cisco and IBM about smart cities, right? This is a buzzword that's out there, and it speaks to, quote unquote, the transformation of our urban areas, and it really boils down to this sort of Jetsonian future with, so why am I not using this? Self-driving vehicles, ubiquitous sensing, right? Sensors on every street corner telling us, you know, what the weather pattern is between 5th Street and 6th Street, and all those sorts of great things. Is there an ice slick in between you and your walk to the bus stop? These kiosks in New York City and in some other cities that they're like the 21st century of the modern public payphone. For those over in this corner of the room, there were once these things called public payphones. If you had a quarter, you could put it in and call whoever you wanted, anybody. 10 cents once upon a time. See, now we're dating ourselves, right? I remember them as quarters. Yeah, and unfortunately they didn't fit in your pocket. That was kind of the rub. But so, you know, these are the things we talk about. And I'm going to grant you, yes, these could be really exciting things. They could be transformative at some level. But there are some real issues there. And one of them is simply that I don't think we know how they're going to transform the city, right? I don't really know that we have a plan of action or a theory of change about what this does. Or what it solves necessarily. I think in a lot of cases the engineers came up with a cool idea, and now we got to figure out what to do with it. And the other issue is a lot of these things are really expensive, right? They don't make sense for most cities or most communities right now. And the third one is, you know, they don't necessarily solve particular community issues. And I want to put a finer point on that. So a colleague of ours over at the city of Boston, who actually has probably spoken here before, Nigel Jacob, actually speaking here later this semester. I'm doing Ted's job for him. I'm plugging the future speakers. So I was at a conference once with Nigel, with actually the guy who invented this particular sensor called Array of Things at University of Chicago. And it was a session about those sensors and what we could do. And Nigel raises his hand and he says, Charlie is the guy who started Array of Things, he says, Charlie, this is nice and all, but I don't need to know what the ambient temperature is on every corner in my city. I need a racism sensor. I need a sensor that goes goes off every time someone in my city is being a racist. That's what would be helpful to me, because that's the problem I have in my city. And it was a really provocative moment, and it kind of threw all the computer scientists and engineers in the room for a loop. But you know, it was important too, because he was basically saying, as a guy who advocates for innovation technology in government, that there are problems that we have that these smart city solutions are not dealing with. And I think that that's, and maybe might not even be capable of dealing with. And I think that's important to kind of tell that anecdote in the context of Luke's story that he just presented us with. But so, this forces me to kind of a question that I've been asking myself for a long time, and has been a real guiding premise for BARI. Note, we abbreviate Boston Area Research Initiative, BARI, as to not be confused with Barry Bluestone, for obvious reasons. But at BARI, a lot of what we think about is, what does it mean for a city to be smart? Right? And I think about that word, and I think about people that I know that are smart, and a smart person knows how to gather information, right? A smart person knows how to take that information, synthesize it into something worth using, and knows how to identify problems and challenges, and thinks of creative ways to approach those problems and challenges. Could that utilize major tools, technology sometimes? Of course. But does it need to, right? Does it need to be premised on the fact that we have data and technology? And the answer to that, in my mind, is no. There are other ways to be smart. And so I make the argument that maybe smart cities is already here in what we call naturally occurring data, right? The massive amounts of information we're constantly generating about our city that can tell us a lot about what's going on, what could happen, how programs are working, how they're being effective, how they're not effective, right? This is just a picture of a tax assessment database, which is rather boring on the surface, but can tell you quite a bit about the city. And there are hundreds of data sets out there like this that are telling us what's going on, whether it be tax assessments, building permits, 311 calls, 911 calls, tweets, people posting to Yelp, people posting to Craigslist. All of these pieces of information tell us about the urban landscape, and the applications are vast and varied. They're technically accessible to all cities and institutions. Now, some cities and some institutions have a little bit less access to data science skills than others, and that's a digital divide we really need to solve. But right now, Boston is the single city in Massachusetts that has the ability to even think about piloting autonomous vehicles. Whereas I can name for you offhand 20 cities and towns that are employing data to inform their decision-making process, if not more than 20, right? And so this is way more accessible as a solution. And the future, therefore, is now. There are things you can do with this now, rather than pointing at something shiny and saying, hey, it's really cool, and in about 25 years, it's gonna change our lives, right? There's something to be done immediately. And so I expound on this for way too long in a book that just came out, called The Urban Commons, and it focuses on 311 data, and specifically the case of being able to use 311 data, these calls for government services, as a way to understand the collaborative maintenance of public spaces, or what I've stylized as the urban commons. And I could talk more about that if people want me to. I don't think it's entirely apropos, I just wanted to note it. But the book goes further and talks about the institutions that can help to drive this sort of activity, right? Which BARI is one of them. We really think about what is the intersection point between data research and policy. And so Luke and I work together a lot, and we kind of have sibling centers, right? His lives at a foundation, and ours lives at an academic institution, and therefore we complement each other in the kinds of questions and projects we pursue in what we might think of as a broader civic data ecosystem, where the academic sector, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, and community leaders are thinking together about how to leverage data to better understand and serve our communities. And then this sort of bigger piece about what is the field in general, and philosophical critiques of what smart cities is, and my use of the term urban informatics. Maybe it's because I direct an educational program in urban informatics and I drank the Kool-Aid, and maybe it's just because I like the term because it's not sexy. It hasn't been laden with these assumptions about futuristic things, and so maybe we understand better exactly what the opportunities are if we boil it down to what it is, which is using data and technology to better understand and serve the city. So quick about BARI. What do we do? What do we try to do? We are an inter-university partnership that pursues urban research that advances both scholarship and policy. And we focus on these opportunities around digital data and technologies. I'll stop talking about us in a minute. And if you want to learn more, you can go check out our website. And how do we do it, right? So our main, as an academic center, our main is to pursue core research policy partnerships. Find ways in which data can catalyze important work that's informative and can even produce things that are useful in the immediate sense for partners who actually do things rather than look at data. But we decided early on we didn't want to be the kind of research center that only produces our own work. We want to enable others to engage in this sort of work as well. So our second area of activity is the construction of something called the Boston Data Portal, which is a public platform where we publish data products from our work at different levels of data literacy. So we publish on our library, we publish the raw data, right? Provided it's not sensitive and all that jazz. But much like Raj Chetty has done with his work, and I'd be rather hubristic to say we do it quite like Raj Chetty does, but we try. And we put out data sets there that are immediately usable by dorks who want to go analyze some data, fully documented, so on and so forth. But we also generate versions that can be put on an interactive map, and we train community groups in how to use those data. And it becomes a public resource that people can engage with to better understand their community, the community they serve, the community they want to support. And then the third thing we do is, and this is actually another place where we work very closely with Luke and his team, is really thinking about how to convene and support this civic data ecosystem. And the centerpiece of this is we host an annual conference that is entirely about data-driven work in Greater Boston. We have room for 48 speaking slots, and this year we had 85 submissions for talks. So quite a good turnout of people doing really awesome work in the region, thinking about how to understand it better. And this year the theme is not just Boston, but how do we start to learn and coordinate these sorts of innovations at a regional level? What role does the state play? All those sorts of questions. So very exciting. It's going to be at the State House this year. So please come if you're interested. It's free admission, April 26, 2019. And ironically, Raj Chetty will be our morning keynote speaker. And we have a couple other folks during the day who are going to be fantastic. So that's what BARI does. And to kind of summarize my perspective here, and then I want to transition into thinking about the problems that Luke has raised for us. The first is just data can help us better understand and serve the city today, right? That's sort of the headline here. And then city-university partnerships, and I should probably expand that to all sorts of cross-sectoral partnerships, are going to be key in that this really is not limited to cities. I think there's a real opportunity to expand into smaller cities and into even suburban areas and such. And you know, we've done projects with people in leaders in Newton, leaders in Arlington, right? These other municipalities that are not quite as large. And something to keep in mind, I think this makes a natural transition to talking a bit about Luke's work. It's about more than just efficiency, right? And I think this is what my story from Nigel kind of captures, right? Sensors and autonomous vehicles are really all about engineering efficiencies, right? They're all about sort of making the world run smoother, and that's great. That's a very important value, but we have other values as a society. And so is there a way to leverage algorithms and technology to pursue equity, to pursue justice, to pursue resilience, and to pursue democracy? And really pushing on those points. So on the equity point, right? So how do we leverage all of this sort of philosophy, all this sort of mission, particularly around equity, if we're going to look to data and technology, not necessarily to be the answer, but a tool in our toolbox. So one approach is actually very consistent with what Luke just did with this report, which is to just better understand inequities, right? What is the nature of inequities and where are they? And so Luke's is a great example, being that you just watched it. I won't re-summarize it for you. But another idea we've had and we've been working on here at BARI is thinking about what we call microplaces, right? So there's this literature around neighborhood effects, right? Where you live matters for your outcomes, independent of any of your individual characteristics. We've decided to drill further and look at streets, not just neighborhoods, but streets. And we did a study looking at academic achievement and found that if you live on a crime hotspot, you have even lower test scores than the guy or gal who lives literally one street over that had no violent crimes in the last year. This is really important because in a high crime neighborhood, we now know that there are many streets that have no crimes. And there are some streets that have a predominant or disproportionate number of crimes. And the fact that your neighborhood and your street both matter is actually a new wrinkle to inequity and inequality we didn't know before this study. And so this is actually a really interesting and important elaboration of how we think about the residential context that people live in. And health disparities. So we were looking at the same idea with we have temperature data in 30 by 30 meter grids for the entire city. And we linked this to streets, and we looked again at neighborhoods and streets and health outcomes. And we find that your neighborhood temperature actually doesn't really predict anything about your likelihood of experiencing a health emergency during a heat advisory. It's your street temperature that matters, right? That micro-spatial, that microclimate that you live in is gonna matter for your personal outcomes. And this is the census block group that contains City Hall. And as you can see here, there's basically like a 20 to 30 degree difference between different parts of just this one census block group, right? This could really matter. And you could be experiencing something dramatically different from one of your neighbors. And so while our traditional models of inequality think that everyone in the neighborhood is in a single bucket, it turns out that they may be in very different micro buckets that are important and consequential. But then, right, there's only so long, and I hate to say this as an academic because my job is to understand things more so than to build things. My job, especially when I think about when I interact with policymakers, I am not elected, I am not appointed by an elected official. My job is not to create policy. My job is to inform people who are empowered to take that action. But yet, I think there's a certain point at which we need to stop looking at the data and finding things out, and we need to actually be building mechanisms for equity, right? Mechanisms that basically can raise up populations and create greater evenness of opportunity. And so we've been doing some studies at least around evaluating this. So youth development and outcomes. So we constructed an opportunity index that addresses geographic inequities with Boston Public Schools. Superintendent Tommy Chang, former Superintendent Tommy Chang approached us and asked us if we could figure out which factors matter across neighborhoods for academic achievement, but then to help him reallocate funding based on that across schools. And so that was a great project. And what I love about it too is it does produce a bottom line number, which the CFO needs to tell each school how much money they get. But we also provide this 5-factor chart for every school telling them what the strengths and challenges of the neighborhoods their students come from are. And that way they can understand and they can target that money towards the kinds of things that their students need. Because right, if your kids live in a neighborhood with high crime, that's a very different type of support that they need than if they come from a neighborhood whose families have lower academic achievement. And you know, the one is probably a matter of trauma, whereas the other one is a matter of when you go home, people might not read to you as much, right? Or correct your grammar, right? Little simple things. And so that's an important tool, we believe. Second one, some of you may have seen this. It got a decent amount of attention in the Globe for obvious reasons. We helped Boston Public Schools evaluate their school choice and assignment process and trying to understand if that algorithm for giving people access to schools was equitable or not. And we found that there were some places where it really could have been better. And we've been working with them to figure out, okay, how do we tweak that to make it more equitable? And to what extent will it be impactful when a lot of your best schools are sitting in neighborhoods that are predominantly white and affluent? And then there's another project that is I take no claim of, but I wanted to highlight it. It's by Alicia Modestino-Sasser, who is here in the School of Public Policy and is Associate Director of the Dukakis Center with TED. And she's been doing some really cool work looking at how summer jobs lead to better student outcomes. Again, thinking about these mechanisms that can create opportunity, that can create equity in the long run. And then last one here I want to talk about is for the urban commons. We looked at 311, and we examined changes in sidewalk quality over 4 years, right? And this actually isn't in the book. This is a follow-on study. But basically the idea that could you use 311 to fix up your neighborhood if it was lagging behind in infrastructure, right? When you think about it, 311 should be a mechanism for equity, right? Traditionally, the way to get someone from Public Works to come to your neighborhood and fix a problem was to call your uncle who works in Public Works, right? And if you didn't have an uncle who worked in Public Works, you were kind of out of luck. That was the old way of doing things, and while it was inequitable, and we could critique it on that level, it was also because there wasn't a mechanism for doing it better, right? There wasn't a call line, right? There wasn't a system. And so 311, in theory, could help fix that. So we looked at change in sidewalk quality over 4 years, and what we found was streets with more calls did not actually have improved quality. That was frustrating for the city to find out. And in fact, they found it out from their own internal analysis, and then we just sort of replicated it for them. But what we did find, and this is in the spirit of Luke giving you guys some teaser graphs, so this has not been released yet, so you're the first people who've seen this publicly. We did find that in neighborhoods that were below median percentage white, once you got above a certain number of 311 calls, you did actually see an increase in quality. And we're trying to tease this out, but our sense is that those neighborhoods tended to have lower quality infrastructure in the first place, or lower maintenance over the years in the first place, and so enough advocacy on their part was able to improve things a bit. Whereas a lot of the white neighborhoods were well enough maintained that it's really just kind of squeaky wheel calling. You're maintaining high quality, but you're not actually changing anything about the situation. But so, an interesting sort of mixed bag story of equity. The problem is a lot of these neighborhoods, well, I mean, this is a regression line, right? So there are neighborhoods that are represented over here. There's more neighborhoods along the blue line are down over here, right? They don't have quite as much engagement. They're not actually making all those calls. What we're seeing here is just if they make those calls, they may see positive outcomes. And then my last point is, how else do we do this? We engage others in the conversation, right? This needs to be a collective, cross-sector, cross-disciplinary effort. And so last year, our conference was actually, the theme was inequality and economic mobility. And I thought it was a fruitful day, and hopefully good projects came out of it and partnerships. And then this year, the conference will be about the region, but as I've said to a number of people, because of the prevailing themes of the region, inequality is going to be a part of the conversation, right? There is going to be a major panel on inequality and opportunity, and I imagine it's going to come up in about half of the other panels. So it's going to be a prominent thing, and I think that it's important for us to keep talking about how to use data and technology to engage this conversation. But so with that said, I want to end with a couple of provocations for us to start this conversation up again and to chat about Luke's report and what we've seen here. So my first thought, and some of these things Luke has already said, but I feel it's worth repeating. The first problem is this local versus regional versus national processes. And again, I'm going to admit, what's going to happen here over the next 10 minutes or 5 minutes is going to be rather dour. I'm going to be posing things that I don't necessarily have any idea how to fix, but I think we need to at least face them. And this first one is local versus regional versus national, right? We are Boston, and if we have the ability to change Boston, that doesn't mean we can change Massachusetts, and it doesn't mean we can change the United States of America. And some of those charts that Luke showed at the beginning really drive home the fact that America's specific brand of capitalism has really exacerbated quite a number of problems that we progressives up in Boston, who we fret and wring our hands about these things, we can't change it on our own. And that really is an interesting challenge, how we operate within that context and how we feel satisfied or fulfilled with what we do, other than move to Copenhagen. And they don't want all of us in Copenhagen. So I find that to be a particularly challenging thing to think about, where it's great to say Massachusetts is doing better than all the rest, but it's really challenging within a national economic system that has been built especially over the last 50 years, right? Since the New Deal, essentially empowered interests have gone out of their way to chip away at a lot of the mechanisms nationally we had in place that supported equity and opportunity. And so then thinking about how we reconcile that with our local goals and find ways to be successful locally in these goals is going to be a real challenge before us in the years to come. Second one. Now we all know that there's a difference between correlation and causation, right? That's hammered into us, right, from the time we take our first science class when we're 11 all the way through. But I want to go a step further and say that there's a difference between causation and effective intervention. This is really, really important. I find way too often that good scientists don't understand that just because they found that A predicts B, A might even cause B. Changing A isn't going to change B at a societal scale, right? And also thinking about how you're changing A is critical. And there's a really important caveat on this from the moving to opportunity experiment, which some people would refer to as, well, problematic. Because what moving to opportunity experiment, it found really mixed results. Now some people are happy to go raving about, oh, it helped, particularly it helped women get access to jobs, and that's great, right? That's a good outcome. The idea of the moving to opportunity experiment, for those who aren't familiar, was to take people from poor neighborhoods and give them vouchers to be able to move into more affluent neighborhoods. The idea was to break the cycle of concentrated disadvantage. But the problem is that it wasn't really an experiment about the effect of disadvantage in a neighborhood. It was an experiment of what happens when you take poor people out of a poor neighborhood and put them in a rich neighborhood. And that's a different experiment, right? That's a very different thing. And the biggest caveat, or the biggest lesson from that experiment that I always keep in mind, is what happened to teenage boys who were moved from one neighborhood to another. They committed more crime, and they got in more trouble, and they did worse in school. Why? Because teenage boys are obsessed with stature, right? Teenage boys are obsessed with being alpha. So you take a poor kid and you put him in a neighborhood where suddenly he is the poorest person. He's going to commit property crime, right? He's going to act out in order to prove himself, in order to demonstrate himself. So this was not an experiment about advantaged neighborhood versus disadvantaged neighborhood and outcomes. This was an experiment of when you take someone out of one environment and you put them in another environment. And I think we need to be very careful when we do public experiments like this, thinking about what it is we're actually operationalizing. What is it we're actually doing? And do we think that attacking the variable A is really going to get us to B? And another way of thinking about this, and this is more abstract, I don't have as good of an example, is, you know, and I've had to think about this a lot this semester because I'm teaching a course on communities and crime. Disadvantage is a pernicious thing. Disadvantage is a multifaceted thing. And it's also it's the kind of thing, it's a little bit like acne, right? You think you've got it down, and then you eat too much chocolate, you don't wash your face one day, and you wake up and suddenly you got a pimple. Not sure that was the best metaphor of the night, but we're gonna go with it, right? I used to teach at UMass Boston, and I remember when I first got there, my boss at the time said to me, the students here are going to be different than the students you've ever taught before. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, their lives are much realer than the places you've taught. And I had no idea what she meant. And I gave some glib like, whatever, it'll be fine, I've taught before, I know what I'm doing. But every semester after that, I had a student come to me with a story that made their work difficult to complete that I had never heard before, right? Like the kid who came to me and said, I'm not going to be in class on Friday, I hope I can get the work done, and I may be back on Monday, or I may be back in 3 to 6 months. It's like, okay, I'm not going to ask any more questions, but apparently you have a court date, right? Or the student who showed up after 6 weeks of not coming to class and told me it's been a really rough semester, I had to get a restraining order for my abusive ex-boyfriend. And it's been a toll on me personally and logistically, so I just haven't been able to come to class. And it's one of those weird moments where I, as professor, it was the last week of the semester, because she then said, how do I pass? And my answer was, you don't, right? You have to withdraw. You're perfectly within your legal rights within the university to withdraw and get an incomplete and get supported that way, but I can't
I can't invent 6 weeks of work for you, right? We have to move on. And so these anecdotes, while maybe superfluous in some ways, I think they illustrate the fact that if you fix A, right, in order to solve B, especially when we're talking about disadvantage, there's a lot of other things going on there, right? There's a lot going on in a disadvantaged community that undermines opportunity, that undermines the achievement of equity, and we need to be prepared for that many-headed beast, right? Rather than assume that if you chop off the head of the hydra that you see now, you're going to kill it, right? You're going to solve the problem. And that's a really, really important lesson. The inconvenience of the free market, right? The free market is great in a lot of ways. At least I've grown up from my communist ruminations of my youth, right? I've come to realize that, okay, the free market has its values, but the free market is also a big, giant tsunami coming for you, and you're not just going to be able to stand in front of it and tell it to stop. And this really resonates for the housing costs issue. I look at the things the mayor says about housing costs and about, standing up and stopping gentrification. And Ted can disagree with me because he actually sits on the BDPA, but I sit there and I say, I don't know how you're going to do it, right? I even say to him, Marty, I don't know how you're going to do it. And Marty doesn't listen to me because he doesn't even know my name. But, that's what I say to myself in those moments, because I look at a report like Luke's and, what strikes me is that I don't know how we lower housing costs given the overwhelming economic pressure of them going up and up and up. The demands of the people like me, right? The people like Luke, who are young professionals, have young families, want to live in Boston, want to be on the Red Line, and that's where they move, right? Now, that doesn't happen to be where I live, but there are a lot of people like me who live there, right? And want to live there, and are, as a result, paying those higher prices, which they can afford, and displacing the people who live there. I mean, what's striking to me was that map where there's an area of Dorchester which looked to me to be near Codman Square, which is probably, what, 70% black, give or take? In that ballpark, right? A disadvantaged, historically black neighborhood for the median rent to be $2,500, right? That's a mortgage for a $600,000 to $700,000 house, right? That's a ton of money, and an unbelievable monthly investment. Or you're not even investing; you're just paying for the roof over your head. Just mind-boggling to me that could be a historically minority neighborhood where the rents are at elite levels, and the free market is what's driving that. And I don't know how you stem that tide without essentially instituting state-level economic policies. Last one, and then I will step down because I've spoken for far longer than I planned to, but I guess I got on a roll. Racially and socioeconomically biased decision-making adds up. And this one I am going to needle Luke a little bit. I feel like it's a little bit quixotic to put in the report, end racial bias, right? I don't know. I guess that's a really hard one for me to say with a straight face because it's there, right? And we all do it at some level, whether it's explicit, implicit, or completely indirect, right? I mean, I'll be completely honest. I live in a town that has a good school district. That's what I looked for. But by doing that, I essentially made a racial decision, right? I didn't think about race when I did it. But I looked at metrics. I want my kids to go to a good school. I end up in a town that's predominantly white. That's just the way it happens, right? And so, I mean, we know that people, there's a lot of evidence from schools around the country, from school districts around the country, like Boston's, that has a school choice and assignment system. Everyone's trying to avoid the schools with black kids. The black kids are trying to avoid schools with black kids, right? Everyone is trying to avoid those places because either they believe or they implicitly have the impression that those are the bad schools, right? That their kids won't get good education there. And this is true in every sector of our society. And again, it varies in its explicitness, to its implicitness, to its indirectness. But none of it generates the outcomes we want, right? Another example here is there's a study done in the 90s about what different races think an integrated neighborhood looks like. And for very, very arguably good reasons, minorities tend to think that an integrated neighborhood neighborhood is 50%. 50% minority, 50% white. White people think an integrated neighborhood is about 20 to 25% minority. Right? And when you think about it that way, again, the free market opens up the opportunity that then you're going to have this tipping point where an integrated neighborhood eventually becomes all white or all people of color. Right? It's not possible to maintain both of those equilibria at the same time in a dynamic system. So I don't know how we fix that, right? I'm not a society level social psychologist to the extent that I know what tools and what mechanisms we have to weed out racial bias. I think that we've come a long way in some ways, right? I grew up in the 90s where it's very interesting to talk to my parents' generation, where my parents' generation is still of the, of the 1960s, we don't see race, right? That's what non-racism was for a very long time. We don't see race. Race doesn't matter, and that will enable equity to happen. Whereas I think we've come a long way in the last really 10 to 15 years in essentially acknowledging, no, wait a moment, we have to know what race people are. We have to know their background. We have to know this intergenerational set of resources and culture that surrounds them to know where they are now and to be able to support them. And I think we're getting there, but I think there's going to be a new set of mechanisms that has to come into play if we're going to get around this challenge that, again, I think is getting better, but it's not going to disappear tomorrow, folks. And it's not going to disappear 5, 10 years from now, right? We need to keep slowly chipping away at it, and I think it's driving and creating a lot of the things that Luke is seeing, where Boston is booming, but for whom? But when you break it down, it's boom. When you even look at the income comparisons as a baseline, there is a racial component to this. And it is real, and it is trenchant. Now, I'm going to say one more thing, and I'm going to step down. This is either promising or depressing, but I noticed in all of Luke's graphs, right, where Boston scored well, didn't score like we were happy with the outcome, but scored better than other cities. What I noticed was the bottom. I took a moment tonight to look more closely at that. They're all in the south, right? And what that says to me is that those cities, and we know this to be true, are really resistant to policy mechanisms that drive equity. Why? Because of racial fear, probably, right? They'd be loath to admit it, but there's a certain equation of poor to black, and then do we really want mechanisms like a strong transit system that's going to allow for us all to intermix, to reach each other's neighborhoods, to work together, so on and so forth, and that fear stands in the way. And I think Boston, for all of its history of having racial difficulty and being, there are some who would critique and say that Boston has a certain progressive liberal attitude that is very into racial integration in theory, but has had difficulty with it in practice at many times. I think we have been building some of those mechanisms in, maybe not as well as we could, but we have been thinking about it, and we're open to it. And so that's my one half positive note I'll end on here. I do think we have some of the running room to really think about some of these challenges in open-minded ways and maybe deal with them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ted, and I think Luke and I are going to go sit at the table and keep talking.
What's a good process here? Should I fire away with some reactions, or do you want to react, Ted? Or
Do you want to react briefly? You get that opportunity before we go to questions.
let me try and do kind of lightning-ish round of reaction to what's on the screen, if that's okay, and I will just really try and not go on too long. First of all, on just a personal note, I have never been a part of a panel in this structure. I've been to only a couple academic conferences that have this structure, and I'm sitting there sort of nervous about where Dan's going to go with the criticisms, but I really appreciate it. Experiencing it just makes me feel like I'd love to explore ways to have this approach a little bit more in my work too. So thank you for spending time to read this ahead of time and prepare comments. It really is helpful for me, and I've never experienced this before. So lightning round reactions. Mostly I just think I am nodding as you're making these observations, and I don't hear many of them as criticisms. Well, maybe I should hear many of them as criticisms.
No, they're really not.
No. On the first one, local versus regional versus national, that was on our mind throughout this research all the way along, and it is tough being a local-based think tank. As I'm doing the research, I'm just increasingly convinced that all of these things are up against national macroeconomic headwinds. So it is tough. I will say one thing I increasingly think is important for us to keep in mind locally is that there is real value in, striving to be a city on a hill and being a laboratory of the states and setting a real model. And I think Massachusetts has an important history of state-level policy successes, and the city of Boston too, that not only have helped materially improve the lives of low-income and moderate-income people in Massachusetts, but also have proved to be a model for changes nationwide. Education reform in the early 1990s, dramatic overhaul of the way we structure our public school system, the way we fund public schools. Our state school funding formula is much more progressive than many states, and my understanding is we dramatically increased the state's commitment to fund local education in the early 1990s. Many other states did follow that lead, I think in part inspired by the work we've done to help level the playing field across communities of very disparate local income and wealth levels. Health reform I mentioned during my comments, I think is another example where we were a real national leader doing a local policy intervention that ultimately really helped pave the way for health reform at the national level. And criminal justice reform, another one. I mean, the state just this past year passed a remarkably sweeping set of reforms to our criminal justice system that my understanding is national experts have both helped the state legislature craft that reform bill and are very optimistic that they think can help make a meaningful difference and can be a national model. So that's something there. Number two, I just totally agree that we need to be careful what insights we really draw from policy experiments. And I've heard some of the back and forth on what we ought to really learn from the moving to opportunity experiment. I don't have much to add, but I think that's really important. The inconvenience of the free market. On housing, I will say, I don't think we have a free market in housing, and I actually maybe would suggest that that's our core problem. I was just a couple weeks ago driving with my wife we live in Somerville, we were driving outside of the city in Winchester. You drive by the commuter rail stop in Winchester, and if you blinked, you would have missed it. It is crazy that there is no housing built around the commuter rail stations throughout our region. Why is there no multifamily housing in Winchester? It's because we don't have a free market in housing, and someone who owns property next to a commuter rail stop can't build housing that people would love to live in. So that's not all of the solution at all. I don't think the free market is the entire solution to our housing problems, but a big part of our problem is that we are dramatically constraining the ability of the free market to provide housing.
And what's interesting about that, wow, this mic is a lot louder, is the cities and towns that are having those opportunistic, like let's build up something big right next to the commuter rail, are the poorer ones, right? So like Chelsea and Revere are seeing these big booms right around their stations, which they can do, or they do because there isn't the opposition, whereas Winchester feels it doesn't need it and doesn't want it, right? Doesn't want the riffraff, so to speak, or the devaluation of everything else, so then they block it.
Yeah, and another version of the housing story, like I've experienced in Somerville, is there are these just knock them down, drag them out fights around new development proposals in the city of Somerville. Important local debates to set the right level of new development in a dense city like Somerville. But to me, it's just a shame that the hottest development debates are in places that are already by far the most dense in our region. And there are no hot development debates. I'm sure there actually are, but I don't think to the same fever pitch as what's happening in Jamaica Plain, Somerville, Cambridge, in the leafy Tony suburbs in our region who just are completely let off the hook.
Okay, let's open up.
This is not a question. The reason why in Winchester they may not want the rail system is noise from the rails.
Well, I think Luke's point is they actually have the rail system, they just don't want anyone putting up triple deckers and apartment buildings around the rail system.
Okay, yes.
Hi, so I have a question for Dan. And I guess like a question more race. And so in academia in general, and I also think it's perhaps reflected in your research team, that there aren't many people from Boston on the research team, and I don't believe there are any people who would self-identify as Black or Hispanic on your research team. But you're doing research, while the Boston Area Research Initiative does research on the Boston area, and recommends policy for primarily Boston residents who might be minority status. So how do you reconcile the idea of academia who's doing the research and then who you're recommending policies to? Or how do you think about these two things?
Yeah, Dan.
This is entertaining because Emma's on the research team. So what I would say, because I'm going to have to say something, I think one of the challenges here is, right, so from where I sit, right, at my desk, my research team is composed of people who show up in my office, right? And then there's a competitive process from that. There are definitely people who show up in my office who aren't a good fit. I don't think in the 5 years I've worked here, I've ever had either a Black or Latino or Latina individual volunteer to be part of the research team. So in terms of composition, it's more or less what presents itself. And in terms of, there is a quirk in terms of, we do have one person on the research team who is Hispanic, Edgar Castro. He doesn't come to the meetings, so you don't see him. So there we go, I'm vindicated at one level. Edgar is, and he is Boston based. He's not from Boston specifically, but he's from one of the suburbs. I think the other thing, and this is just a quirk, especially for master's students who are Boston based tend to be Boston based and studying here because they work locally. And so then they don't need a job working for me doing data analysis. They have their job, right? And so they take courses, and I may know them and I may mentor or advise them, but they will not end up on the research team as a result. So you're right, there's some disconnections there, but I think most of them are structural in their origins. But to your question of how do we think about our work, I think it's okay, and the reason why I think it's okay is because the graduate and undergraduate students who work on the teams are learning a ton about the place that is outside their window. A lot of people go to college or graduate school and never really get to know the place where they're studying, right? They never really connect with it. It's sort of like an extended dorm, and so I think actually they're getting a real benefit from doing research that exposes them and forces them to think about and understand the community that they are living within for either a temporary period of time, or if they move here, they fully understand it as they become part of the community. So I think there's a value there, and I guess it also is okay to me because the people developing the questions, the people developing the projects, do have deep understanding and concern for Boston, because graduate students and undergraduate students are working within a team that already exists, right? And that's led by myself and my colleagues, and oftentimes we are partnering directly with public agencies, and those public agencies are helping us to craft the questions that that they believe will serve and support the needs of Greater Boston. So I do feel we're well informed in those regards, and do keep ourselves tethered, which I think a lot of academics end off in their own stratosphere of thought, where we maintain our grounding by working with partners at the City of Boston, partners like Luke, who think about these things through the foundation lens every day. So you're right, I mean, the team itself could probably be more from Boston than it is, but I think that we managed to keep our compass through our partnerships.
I'll just add something which I think is for Northeastern a related issue, and that is to say that 15 or 20 years ago, Northeastern was viewed regional sources, and where a focus on the kinds of urban issues that you deal with, that both of you deal with, was kind of embedded in Northeastern's DNA, and not just within sociology, but in the law school and in economics and in a lot of other departments. Now, we have one of the highest numbers, not even percentages, but numbers of international students of any university in the country. Something in excess of 14,000 international students now attend Northeastern, and to a large extent, when they arrive, they're thinking that they want to develop the data management and technical skills that will equip them to graduate to go to work for global data-driven enterprises such as Amazon or Google or any of the other large companies or startups. And so to interest them in looking at racial comparisons and the effect of racial comparisons as between, for example, Dorchester and Ipswich, it may not necessarily be the thing that they prioritize as part of their learning, because they're not necessarily thinking that when they graduate, they're going to be doing urban planning. And urban planning of a sort where studying issues in New England will necessarily equip them to think about the same kinds of issues in Kyoto or Istanbul. And we do have internally an issue in terms of engaging, I believe, some of our global students in the kinds of studies that you folks have been working on, because we are challenged to get those students to think about income inequality other than at a level of how their own opportunities will be increased because of the learning that they do here, and their own incomes will be at the top rather than at the bottom of the scales that we depict on these slides. So the way we think about urban and regional planning and issues and the application of data to that, I think needs to be transformed in some respects to increase the level of engagement that we see as among the students who are here now. Yes?
You presented some useful data on the inequality issues and the mobility issues. The problem is that social psychologists have shown that people tend to grossly overestimate mobility and underestimate inequality. How do you suggest we go about changing people's perceptions?
Luke, do you
Ted, here's the mic.
Yeah, Ted, you're the wise. So, I mean, I'll do my best here. I don't have a good answer for you, an exact mechanism.
But we should repeat the question.
Oh yeah, the question was how do we? So basically, we presented these really stark pieces of information about inequality and mobility. And the point is, social psychologists have demonstrated that when left to their own devices, humans like to, or have the tendency to diminish or underestimate levels of inequality and overestimate mobility in general, and probably their own capacity for mobility with a little, elbow grease and stick-to-itiveness, the old rags to riches story. I think it's messaging, right? And so this is me moonlighting as a social psychologist for 30 seconds. I don't know what the message is, and people will probably have done and probably need to do more, ABC testing on what kind of message gets across to people in an appealing way that they internalize it and don't try to reject it. But trying to get the information across to them in a way that really captures, no, this is the extent of inequality, this is the level of it. And then also mobility, but I think, again, we need to think about slippery slopes and unintended consequences, right? When you tell people that a place is more unequal, they change their behavior. actually become more what we would call economically conservative. Not fiscally conservative, but more like, now I'm really scared that I could fall down the ladder. I need to protect myself. I don't actually like resource redistribution policies in this sort of situation because I'm really worried that I'm going to lose that little bit that I have. And there's a student who Bari funded on a research seed grant last year at UMass, no, it was at Brandeis, who has been thinking about this extra question of perceived stability, right? There's mobility, there's inequality, but then there's stability, right? How comfortable do you feel at your rung of the ladder, or like the ladder's about to break apart? And so I think that it's going to require more social psychological research, but very heavily applied social psychological research that figures out what kind of messaging is effective in getting across these facts, but also figuring out which of these facts we want to be effective in getting across, for fear of we cause people to behave in ways we really didn't anticipate, and then kind of blow up the situation, like reinforce the situation.
I'm glad Dan answered that first, because as you were talking about the framing decisions, it just made me think of one thought, which is a frame that I like and find motivating around this stuff is the idea of trying to build an economy that works for everybody. I find that inclusive. It's something we can all nod our heads to, and a lot of the kind of specific analyses in here where our economy is falling short of that, I think is something that can still motivate us, but hopefully it doesn't pit people against each other.
Thank you. So in class earlier we were talking about metrics. In class earlier we were talking about metrics and measuring metrics. Like how would you measure metrics of success on a policy level? Thinking about wealthy organizations and your roles, positions in them. How do you use data to measure, or what data metrics do you use to measure your success, particularly around addressing the racial and socioeconomic gap? Just personally, as a person of color in the space at Northeastern, oftentimes I find that I'm interested in working on, from a technical side, some of the policy stuff, but I find that the culture is not inclusive. Therefore, I don't want to bring my technical expertise to a space where maybe socially isn't as inclusive. So thinking about, again, your roles and your positions, the metrics of success to address the representation around who is doing the work.
I have a reaction, which is just to, I think the things you're flagging are truly important. I'm totally convinced that the people you work with day to day have a material effect on how the work gets done. One observation about my work at the Boston Foundation, so Boston Indicators is a 3-person research team embedded in a broader 100-person Boston Foundation. And it's been really interesting to see in just the 2.5 years I've been there, the internal composition of the foundation change as, especially so there's the program area, which I think of as really the core of the foundation, that's organized to do grant making within education, jobs and workforce development, neighborhoods and housing, arts and culture, and education. And there has been a very intentional commitment within that program area to, over time, recruit a more diverse team to, in their case, I mean, they are doing this critical work as the community foundation in Boston and being very intentional about connecting the grant making they're doing with community groups representing neighborhoods in Boston that are most underserved. And I think if you talk to program team members, they would say there's a whole bunch of work to continue doing on that front, but I think some important work has happened, and it's just critical. I mean, the foundation will not well serve our community if we aren't representative of it.
Most of us, I don't think, really understand how foundations work, and particularly how they work in relation to the kind of work you do, collecting policy-oriented data. So when you do a report, like the report you showed here, how does that then translate into funding decisions and policy?
It's a great question. I mean, sometimes it's more direct than others, but I'll give a concrete example. So about 1.5 years ago, a new director of our health and wellness program area was hired, Inequality Blanding. She was doing a round of strategic planning for the future of our health and wellness work. historically our health and wellness work had focused a lot on the wellness side of that. It was about physical fitness for high school students, addressing childhood obesity. Really important work, but it was just a slice of what you think of as a broader health and wellness portfolio. She was doing some thinking about what are the other areas they might want to shift some of their resources into, and conversations around the opioid crisis kept coming up. So she engaged indicators in just helping to think through how big is the crisis here locally, and it led to, I mentioned really quickly at the beginning of my comments, the report we did in partnership with her team on the state's growing opioid crisis. And she is now pivoting a portion of her work towards trying to directly address this crisis. So again, I don't think our work one-to-one is leading that shift, but it's trying to be responsive to leaders in that area, asking questions and being kind of a consulting resource for them as they're doing that thinking.
Yes?
Two tiny questions about Luke's charts. The chart that showed the movement, rather the growth of high income and low income at the expense of the middle class, how is middle class defined? Question one. Question two is, clearly this is the longest we've gone in class all semester without mentioning the number 8.
What's the
median
Net worth.
net worth of blacks in Boston. I got the impression from looking at your numbers where you didn't address that directly, that you must have had that number somewhere, and it wasn't 8.
Great. Yeah, so I'll try and both. So on the first question, how we define middle class, reasonable people can define it differently. For that analysis, we defined it as households earning between 80 and 120% of median income. Just as a quick aside there, right after we released our report, the Urban Institute nationally released an analysis comparing the relative size of the middle class in every metro area in the United States. The Census Bureau has 388 census-defined metro areas in the country, or 380 something. And they had a slightly different definition of middle class. They made some regional adjustments for cost of living. Boston ranked 377th out of their analysis. So the findings, I think, are consistent under different parameters. On the wealth question, we actually do cite that Color of Wealth study in our report. The actual print report, which, by the way, before folks leave, we have a bunch of copies if anybody's interested in a print copy of the report. The report is structured a bit differently from what I did in this, just for time, but there's a whole section on wealth where we cite that data and also cite some national data on the racial wealth gap also. So
you agree with the number?
Yeah, I mean, that study was a survey methodology where it's a point in time estimate. I think there's no question there is a massive racial wealth gap in the area. And that number was not inconsistent with other data that I've seen.
Question, Luke. With the housing issue, as a researcher, what would a equitable outcome look like for you? What do you define as that? And how do you know that there's progress happening based on what you've done so far?
That's a great question. I mean, the first place my mind goes to is just reducing housing costs across the board. How we get there is a big, tough conversation, but I think it is some combination of meaningful zoning reform that really requires not just the inner core of our region, but the wealthy suburbs to pull much more of their weight in terms of producing multifamily housing. A quick aside, I think all too often when people hear the term segregation, they picture low-income communities of color in a city. I think just as much when we think of segregation, we need to picture Wellesley and Sudbury and Concord. That's as much of the problem in our region. We have set up a system where, with minimum lot sizes, it's literally against the law to build dense multifamily housing. And so addressing those challenges would be top of mind for me.
And to reinforce Luke's last point there, so last year at our conference, one of the morning keynotes was Tim Reardon, who is Director of Data Services at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and he showed us the graph. He shows a graph that basically
demonstrated racial and socioeconomic segregation for the city of Boston. And he said, now you all know what this graph looks like, and put it up there, and he said, now I'm gonna blow your mind. I'm gonna show you the same exact graph for greater Boston, which you don't see very often, and it was dramatically worse, right? And so as, you know, as Luke says, we talk about neighborhoods, and we think about neighborhoods being segregated within the city. I don't think we think as much about how racially and socioeconomically segregated our municipalities are surrounding the city, and how the policies, as Luke says, right, reinforce that.
Okay, and I'll do two last shout outs here. First to Dan, whose work with Bari I think is extraordinary, and I'm going to ask you to remind folks again of the upcoming conference. If you like these classes, you will love that day-long conference because it's an opportunity to hear in very short form from over 40 people who are working with local universities, local municipalities, local private sector firms that are doing data research and analysis that applies to urban and regional policy. So details on that again. And then to Luke, we do have copies of the report. It's beautifully produced, full of great information. Please come and take a copy of the report. But Dan?
Thank you, Ted. Happy to plug one more time. It'll be April 26th. It's a full day event. Come for as little or as much as you want. It's going to be at the State House, it's a fantastic venue. And to Ted's point, it is a cross-sector community, both in the talks and in the audience. So I would say we actually have an even split of academic researchers and policymakers speaking over the course of the day, plus a good amount of nonprofits and private corporations. So a real range of who is speaking and presenting their work.
Last comment, Luke?
Oh, thanks for having me. The conference is great. I've been the last 2 years and been marginally involved in helping organize it, but Dan is a tour de force, and each year it's just more and more engaging and well organized, so worth attending.
Thank you all for coming, and stay warm and dry out there.